The question is that the motion be agreed to. Portal Williams.
Oh, kia ora ana, and thank you, Mr Speaker. Firstly, I do want to acknowledge the member for bringing the bill to the House and for its judicious passage through various stages, and I do also need to acknowledge the hard work of the Health Select Committee. We often remark that our Select Committees work very hard, and in this case I have to say it was very, very true. It took some months of some extraordinary work to bring some clarity to this particular piece of legislation, and I also want to note that the officials and the advice that was sent to the committee was very useful in getting the legislation to the stage that we are at now. But first, before I launch into what is going to be a fairly technical contribution to this piece of legislation, sir, I want to just add a little celebratory note and welcome Charlie Douglas Hipkins into the world, the baby boy of our senior whip, Chris Hipkins, and his partner Jade. Yes, the baby boy of our baby boy, as the Honourable Ruth Dyson has said. So welcome, Charlie Douglas Hipkins. Mr Speaker,
he's a Dakota.
I just want to quote from the report from the Select Committee about the proposed amendments, and I think it's a little bit of an understatement in that we said we recommend substantial changes to the bill to provide for cost neutrality for donors. It became clear through the submission process that there were additional complexities in the organ donation regime, and this has led us to recommend significant changes to the bill. And here are some of them that we recommended, Mr Speaker. Firstly, I do want to note that the Attorney-General did raise some concerns with regards to the Bill of Rights Act, and as our previous speaker and the sponsor of the bill has already noted, it is really around the ability for beneficiaries who may have income to actually be entitled to compensation should they become organ donors. And some of the examples that were quoted, Mr Speaker, are people who may be working part-time and receiving New Zealand superannuation or a veteran's pension, as they are able to do. In the bill that came to the Select Committee, they would not have been eligible for financial support. So at the Attorney-General's request, the Select Committee made the due amendments to the bill, so it means that those donors could actually receive reimbursement for 100% of their foregone employment income. We also suggested and got some very good advice on who should actually be responsible for the bill, whether it should sit with the Ministry of Social Development, who are, as we all know, responsible for ensuring that our citizens have adequate income. But it was felt that given the technical nature of the donations, that there are often some mitigating factors around what will happen with recovery times, what complications may come up during surgeries, for example, that was felt that the Director General of the Ministry of Health was more appropriate to manage this. So the committee suggested, and it was taken up, that the responsibility moved to the Ministry of Health. The Select Committee in its report back clarified several things. The organs that qualify to be part of this piece of legislation. Currently we conduct kidney and liver transplants in New Zealand, but we are able to offer a range of other transplants. We currently are not doing them, but it was felt that we needed to ensure that the ability to provide for those organ transplants later on should be provided for, and that is through regulation, I believe, in this legislation. We have included a new clause 9, which defines what is actually a qualifying donor, and that's very important because a donor has to be someone who donates to a person who's actually able to receive a publicly funded health service in New Zealand. And it also needs to be for someone who is going to undertake a transplant, their transplant surgery in New Zealand. Clause 4 actually defines what surgery is and actually ensures that this relates to the surgery to collect an organ for donation and then to transplant that into a recipient. Clause 10 looks at extending the period of entitlement to earnings compensation by up to 12 weeks post-surgery. Now that is to ensure that we're all human and we recover at different rates, and sometimes we need a little extra time to ensure that we can recover well before we're required to go back to work. So we looked at extending the entitlement by 12 weeks. Clause 12 provides for compensation for donors should they need time prior to the surgery to do things like assessments and tests, to judge eligibility, for example. So there is provision to be compensated for loss of earnings in that period of time. And Clause 13 sets out the discretion by in terms of being able to provide compensation for some other additional items should it become necessary on a case-by-case basis, and it sets out the payment deadlines of no more than 30 days after payment is due. The biggest part, I guess, really was also looking at the structure of earnings compensation and looking at the definition of earnings. And we looked to a model that's already working for us, and that is really the definition of earnings as we see it in the ACC legislation. And that was really due to the complexity that we have around calculating income, especially when we're looking at people who may be donating if they're self-employed. And the definitions within the Accident Compensation Corporation Act give some very good definitions about how we can deal with that complexity. It also, we also looked at how we might provide for donors who might have some foreign sourced income. And for that, we look to the provisions of the Income Tax Act, specifically YD4 of that, and use the definition around YA1 of the Income Tax Act with regards to the foreign sourced income. We have ensured that the rate of compensation and payment schedules are included in new Clause 11, and based payment on weekly, fortnightly or monthly as determined by the Director General. Clauses 13 to 17 deal with such matters as calculating income that comes from a range of sources, and also from the foreign sourced income, and the role of the Director General with regards to decision making, resolving disputes and reviewing decisions are dealt with in clauses 17, 18 and 20. And the recovery of payments, which is an important factor if there are any potential overpayments, that's dealt with in clause 27. And clauses 21 to 25 actually deal with the disputes. Mr Chairman, in the time I have remaining to me, there are far more technical aspects to this piece of legislation, but I just want to make one final note, one final comment, and that is, I guess, by way of dedication to a friend of mine, Catherine Mary Jacobs, who for many years was on the list for a kidney donation and sadly wasn't able to receive a kidney donation, and we talked often about what that might look like for her in her life should she be lucky enough to have somebody donate to her. She was unable to get a donation at that time. We were pretty much reliant on people passing on and providing donations from that source. And she had a couple of people who indicated that they were keen to donate their kidneys to her, but of course at that stage it was financially impossible for them to do so. So I dedicate this reading to my friend Catherine Mary Jacobs. Thank you, Mr Speaker.